The night moves differently when you talk about Frank Costello. His world wasn't loud, wasn't frantic, wasn't made of shouting gunmen or bloody alleys, at least not in the way people imagine the American Mafia. Costello's world was quieter, slower, almost polite, like a man who walked into the storm but never let the wind wrinkle his suit jacket. He wasn't the kind of gangster who kicked in doors. He was the kind who knocked politely and was invited inside. The story begins in Calabria, Italy, a small patch of hillside villages where the air smelled like olive wood smoke and the mountains looked like old men kneeling in prayer. Francesco Castiglia was born there in 1891 into a place where poverty was the anthem and survival the only art a family truly mastered. His mother, Maria, was gentle, too gentle for the brutality of the era. His father, Luigi, was a man who worked until his back curved like a question mark. They sailed for America when Frank was 4. The ship was crowded, families huddled like cattle. Babies cried as if they were announcing themselves to the new world. Luigi held his son by the shoulders and whispered, "Look out there, Frankie. That's the land where a man can choose what he becomes." But no one warned him that in New York, the streets took that choice away and replaced it with another. Little Italy, 1900s, the neighborhood that raised him. The Castiglia family stepped into East Harlem, a place buzzing with noise. Street vendors shouted through the steam rising from sewer grates. Kids chased each other under fire escapes. Laundry hung like broken flags between the buildings. It was a neighborhood built on the backs of immigrants, Irish, Jewish, Italian. They didn't mix, they didn't forgive. And for young Frank, the world drew its first hard line the moment he learned English in a place where fists spoke louder. But Frank wasn't born for violence. He wasn't like the other boys who fought to prove themselves. He was small, quiet, and had that strange ability, even as a child, to read the room before he walked into it. He didn't threaten, didn't intimidate. He observed. And yet, crime crept into his life like a shadow stretching across the sidewalk. The older boys ran errands for gang leaders. They carried number slips, shook down local shopkeepers, stole bottles from delivery trucks. Frank tried to stay away until he realized something unsettling. Crime rewarded intelligence. School didn't. By age 13, Frank was doing small-time work, not because he was drawn to danger, but because it was the only world that made sense. His friends admired muscle. Frank admired order. Then, one night changed everything. The night the neighborhood went quiet. It was winter. Snow thickened the streets until the city lights looked like they were underwater. A man got stabbed outside a corner store, an Irishman, a crowd gathered. No one spoke, no one stepped forward, just silent faces. Under street lamps, watching the blood melt into the snow. Frank didn't watch the dying man. He watched the crowd. He saw fear. He saw power. He saw how silence could be used, how control wasn't held by the strongest, but by the calmest. And in that moment, he understood what his future would look like. He didn't need to be the loudest man in the room. He only needed to be the one everyone else listened to. The man who built his empire with words, not bullets. Frank's rise began quietly, almost invisibly. By the 1910s, he ran with a gang of Italian boys who learned how to make money the way the streets taught them, bootlegging liquor, running dice games, and slipping past police patrols like rats avoiding daylight. But Frank wasn't a rat. He was patient. He was strategic. His memory was razor sharp and his instincts even sharper. He didn't waste breath. He didn't brag. He watched, he learned, and he was noticed. Meeting Charlie, Lucky Luciano. There are moments in history where two men cross paths and unknowingly change the fate of an entire criminal empire. For the American Mafia, that moment happened in the 1910s when Frank Costello met a young gangster named Charles Luciano. Lucky was the opposite of Frank in every way. Bold, fearless, charismatic, unpredictable. Where Frank spoke softly, Lucky spoke loudly. Where Frank avoided fights, Lucky ran toward them. But together, they were unstoppable. Lucky had ambition. Frank had discipline. Lucky had vision. Frank had structure. The two became natural partners, and by the early 1920s, they merged their operations like businessmen merging companies. Prohibition had arrived, and with it, the greatest financial opportunity in organized crime history. Frank wasn't a traditional bootlegger. He built networks, not just criminal crews, but connections with politicians, judges, and police captains. He bribed not with money alone, but with promises of stability. Where other gangsters spilled blood, Frank bought peace. Where others caused chaos, Frank created order. And in the underworld, order was priceless. The Whiskey Empire. During Prohibition, Frank Costello became one of the largest liquor suppliers in New York. He didn't make headlines because Frank didn't allow headlines. His operations were too clean, too organized. He paid cops before trouble started. He negotiated with rival gangs before bullets flew. He navigated the criminal world the way a chess master plays the board, 3 moves ahead, eyes steady, unshaken by noise. Soon he earned a reputation few gangsters ever held. He was trustworthy. In a world of betrayal and paranoia, Frank was the rare man who kept his word. The Commission. By 1931, after the bloody Castellamarese War ended, Lucky Luciano created the Commission, the governing body of the American Mafia. A national council meant to stop the endless killings and structure the underworld like a corporation. And sitting beside him, quiet and composed, was Frank Costello. He didn't need a gun on the table. He brought something far more dangerous: influence. Frank wasn't a soldier or a capo. He was an advisor, an architect, maybe even the conscience of the Luciano family. When bosses argued, Frank calmed them. When tempers burned, Frank cooled the room. His gift wasn't fear. It was persuasion. And soon, he became the one thing gangsters rarely become: a statesman. The Prime Minister of the Underworld. The nickname came from the newspapers first, the Prime Minister of the Underworld. Not because Frank ruled through violence, but because he ruled through influence. He controlled politicians the way some men controlled soldiers. His reach extended into New York's Tammany Hall, into City Hall commissions, into police precincts, and even into judges' chambers. Where others thrived on fear, Frank thrived on diplomacy. Gambling. The hidden kingdom. As Prohibition faded, Frank needed a new empire. He found it in gambling, slot machines, horse betting, casinos tucked inside nightclubs, bookmakers operating out of telephone booths. He turned illegal gambling into a multi-million-dollar business. In the South, especially in Louisiana, Costello's operation grew so influential that politicians practically bent around him like shadows following a lamp. He didn't conquer with muscle. He conquered with persuasion, generosity, and loyalty. But power always invites danger. Vito Genovese, the shadow. Waiting in the dark. Genovese was pure ambition wrapped in cruelty. He hated Frank's calm power, hated how Costello controlled the family while Genovese waited in the wings like a wolf starving for the throne. Genovese didn't respect diplomacy. He respected one thing: fear. For years, tension simmered between the two men, and Frank, who had survived street life, prohibition, gang wars, and the violent reshaping of the Mafia, finally faced a threat he couldn't negotiate with. The assassination attempt, 1957. It was spring. The city hummed with warm night air. Frank returned home to his Manhattan apartment building, carrying nothing but a small briefcase and the calm aura of a man who believed he had already survived the worst. But at the lobby entrance, a man stepped from the shadows. Vincent the Chin Gigante, a gun in his hand, nerves twitching. A trigger pulled too fast. The bullet grazed Frank's head. He staggered, fell, and the shooter fled into the night. Doctors expected panic from Costello. Instead, he whispered, "I didn't recognize the shooter." It was a lie, an intentional one, a final act of diplomacy. Even after the attempt on his life, Frank refused to identify his enemy. Genovese took over the family. Frank stepped back. He wasn't defeated. He simply walked away from the throne he never wanted to begin with. And in the underworld, that quiet act of refusal echoed louder than revenge. The man who survived. Everyone after the shooting, Frank Costello did something no one expected. He retired. Not to a mansion, not to a hideout, but to a quiet life. gardening, golfing, and enjoying the last thing he had earned, peace. He remained respected. Even Genovese left him alone, knowing Frank no longer sought power. The FBI harassed him with trials, indictments, tax charges, anything they could put on paper. But Frank stayed calm through it all. He testified before the Senate with the same soft voice he used in backroom meetings. One senator said, "Mr. Costello, you're not answering the questions." Frank replied, "Sir, I think I'm answering more than you realize." He knew the game, he knew the rules, and he knew how to walk the line without falling off. By the time he entered his 70s, most of the men he rose with were dead, imprisoned, or betrayed. Luciano died in exile, Genovese died behind bars, Meyer Lansky lived hunted. Carlo Gambino outmaneuvered rivals until fate caught him too. Frank Costello lived quietly, and remarkably long. Maybe it was luck, maybe intelligence, maybe the calm he carried in a world full of noise. But when he died in 1973, at age 82, he didn't die in blood. He died in his bed, with his wife nearby, and with a legacy unlike any other mobster in American history. The gentleman gangster Frank Costello left behind no string of violent legends, no trail of public murders, no chaotic downfall. Instead, he left a reputation. The gangster who preferred peace over war, order over chaos, conversation over conflict. He was the Mafia's diplomat, the man who bridged worlds, the quiet kingmaker who never needed the title. His life became a lesson whispered in back rooms long after he was gone. Power isn't just about fear. It's about being the man everyone trusts when the room catches fire. And in the long, slow history of the American Mafia, no flame burned steadier, and no shadow stretched farther than Frank Costello's.